I'm not sure that I'm going to use the microphone because I don't think I could see over the lectern, which is usually a problem. So if you'll bear with me, even though of small stature, I do seem to have a big mouth. And so as a result, I'm going to try to do this without the use of the microphone, but with, of course, having this, which helped Robin cash in the back. And I do want to acknowledge Robin for his effort, along with Joe Ossie here, his effort, both of their efforts, in having me be here tonight. Now, hopefully at the end of the evening, you won't regret that, but hopefully not. Very glad to be here and very glad that you are here this evening because you could be doing a lot of other things, particularly during the holiday season, but you chose to be here. So what is going around are a couple of items of information that you all should have. Okay, this tri-fold brochure of Move to Amend that I'm going to talk about, a sheet that you should have with this little Move to Amend icon logo in the top right, all right? And then there should be a petition going around that hopefully you will be inclined to sign and join the more than 450,000 other people all across the country who have thus far agreed to join this growing movement that is trying to enact a 28th constitutional amendment. Not an easy lift, to be sure, but one that we believe is absolutely necessary given the conditions that we find ourselves in today, politically, but not only politically, because the crises we are facing, my friends, these days are certainly political, but they include other realms of reality. We have multiple forms of economic crises, all the forms of bubbles out there in terms of debt that is befalling students, people who own homes because we have a mortgage bubble again, people who have purchased new vehicles recently, there's a car loan bubble. There's every bit, if you are a municipal official at a local level or a state level, you probably have some attention to the various debts that your state is incurring, which seem to be rising. And I just came from Illinois, and oh boy, that particular state is incredibly underwater, as are many, because of these things called legacy costs. So we have bubbles galore in that field and realm, economically, and crises galore. We also have, somebody told me, we have something called an ecological crisis. Ever hear of that? Which is affecting every community. In fact, today, your local newspaper talked about how the recent report that just came out from the Trump administration, the day after Thanksgiving, of course, when nobody is looking at the news, defined and decided and looked at the impact of climate change, not just globally or nationally, but right here in the Cedar River Valley. And that ain't a pretty picture. We have social crises, which are causing the ripping apart of, in many cases, unless we deal with it, of people, of communities, of ethnicities. Any one of these crises could be profound in causing a breakdown of the social order, but one, of course, could trigger another. The point that I raise in bringing those up is that we are facing many crises, fundamental and profound, and I've always been told that when you have a big problem, you need a big solution. And that simply trying to put a Band-Aid on some problems that are much more fundamental and profound just simply isn't going to work. You need a tourniquet in some cases, or you need a much larger, you need to undergo surgery. Something fundamental. And that's what we think our approach is to dealing with the multiple crises. And the multiple crises, in fact, many people, when you just talk about the ecological crisis, they ultimately say the ecological crisis is centered on a political crisis. Because so long as we, the people, don't have the fundamental right to decide what goes on in our communities, and whether you call that right to decide, lack of sovereignty, lack of self-determination, lack of self-governance, lack of democracy, lack of an authentic, workable, Republican form of government. Whatever you call it, the point is that decreasingly, we the people are not able and capable of making the necessary, profound decisions that affect our lives, our families, our neighborhoods, our communities, our state, our nation, and what is left of our natural world. That's just the reality. I wish it was different. But that certainly seems to be the case, and I don't think I'm over-exaggerating the point that we decreasingly are living in anything approaching a democracy, again, republic, self-governance, self-determination, whatever your descriptor is. And part of the reason for that, not the only, don't want to oversell it, but part of it is because our government, many people think, our government is broken. I don't think it's broken, but I think rather it's fixed, as in rigged, to benefit the super-duper wealthy few and to benefit corporate entities. And unless we deal with these two constitutional doctrines associated with those two things, we're not going to, I think, fundamentally deal with the problems that are in front of us. So, what Move to Amend is all about is trying to address those two constitutional doctrines that have allowed money to run roughshod over our political system, and which has allowed corporate entities to basically not just be involved in our economic decision about what the prices are, what the colors of car offerings are, or what lemony scents or lavender scents of the perfume to wash our floors are going to be. Not just economic decisions, but political decisions, governing. That's the kind of power and authority that corporations have acquired. And that's what Move to Amend is trying to do. So, this outfit got going, Move to Amend, the day of the Citizens United decision, literally. Many people who started this group thought, oh my goodness, 6 months ahead of time, this ain't looking pretty. We better start trying to get ahead of the organizing curve and be ready once that decision comes down, because it's going to be ugly and it's not going to go our way, and we need to do something to respond to it in a profound way. And so people launched the website, movetoamend.org, the very day, January 21st, 2010, when Citizens United, very controversial, 5-4 decision, came down from the Supremes, otherwise known as the U.S. Supreme Court. And when the Supremes made that decision, we immediately launched this site, put it out there, and within 48 hours had something on the order of 200,000 people who had already signed this petition that's going around right now, that hopefully all of you have signed, and I promise not to turn over that information to the NSA, CIA, FBI for at least 72 hours, okay? So that's when the decision happened, and that's how we responded. But from day one, the basic principles of Move to Amend are these, that we believe that while we started in response to Citizens United, the problems associated with money in elections and corporate constitutional right, otherwise known as, anyone ever hear the term corporate personhood? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, some of that may have to do with a guy named Mitt Romney that was in your fair state a couple of years ago. Remember? And he was asked at the Iowa State Fair, hey, what do you think, Mitt, about corporate personhood? And he said, about corporations? He said, what did he say? Anybody know?
Corporations are people.
Or what?
Corporations are people.
My friend. Remember that? So, he sort of added to the incredible nonsense and to the myth and to the hideousness of the sense of corporations being akin to persons and having inalienable constitutional rights. So, Move to Amend, one of the basic premises is that if we're going to have a constitutional amendment, it sure as heck better not only address Citizens United, and it does, because if you only believe that these problems associated with money and politics and corporate rule began, then you must be of the persuasion that we had a grand, glorious democratic nirvana the day before Citizens United passed. Remember those wonderful democratic days when our voices were being heard, our needs were being met, our communities were being serviced? Neither do I. We didn't. Now it worsened. It certainly worsened. But the problems associated with corporate rule and money in elections preceded Citizens United by a very long time. And that timeline over on the wall, if you have a chance before we're kicked out of the library, if you have a chance to take a gander at that, you will see that way on the far right is the Citizens United decision, way on the far right, but way to the left, all the way to the beginning, and above the line of the time date is rights and powers, gains and loss by corporations, and below rights and gains, powers and loss by wins and losses, gains and losses by individuals below the line. And you'll see that corporate power, corporate rule goes way back by more than a century, and money corrupting our political system begins at least as early as 1976 in a Supreme Court decision called Buckley versus Vallejo, when money was defined as speech, which is bizarre. So we'll get into that in a minute. So that's one of the basic principles. We only get one shot generationally, if that, at having a constitutional amendment. Shouldn't we make it worth the while and not simply sell ourselves short? I believe we do. If we're going to go through all this effort, expend all this energy, lose even more hair than I've lost, and be involved in making all these sacrifices, let's go, and I'm into food, I haven't had dinner yet, let's go for the whole enchilada and not just a piece of it. Because the problems are not just nickel and dime associated with a little bit of money here that's corrupting and a little corporate rule there. No, it's profound. And it goes back a very long time. And whatever degree of democracy we ever had to begin with, and that's debatable, that has been usurped, that has been hijacked, that has been preempted, dare I say, that has been trumped by corporate power and by money in elections. And I use the word trump as a verb, not as a noun. We may think Trump, the noun, has some problems, and we could talk about it, debate it and all, but trump the verb, as in hijacking or preempting democratically enacted laws by corporate entities, goes way back and has been more harmful and more odious than Trump the noun, at least up to this point. That may change. So, Move to Amend believes we need a constitutional amendment that deals with much more than Citizens United, that deals with all these problems. We're going to get into it in a minute. But the other principles are these, that we need to build a movement like those that preceded us that have brought about significant change in this country. Because if you remember, that original thing we call the Constitution, which is way over there on the left, and it exists on the above, and mostly above, rights and powers, gains and loss of corporations. It's, in a sense, somewhat of a loss. Because while we, the people, first three words were tremendous, and other parts of the Constitution were tremendous, who had rights under the original Constitution?
Few landowners.
White male property owners. Everybody else was less than a person. 3/5 of a person, if you were a person of color. If you were a woman, what? You were part of a rib that came from the guy, and you basically had no rights other than those you got from your husband, your father, your brother, that kind of thing. And if you were a Native American, indigenous person, you basically had not just 3/5, 2/5, you had 0/5 rights. You were considered, in the eyes of many founders, a beast. So a lot of these movements to amend the Constitution before, what we're trying to do, were movements of people organized by people that should have been in the Constitution from day one. They were forced to drive themselves into the Constitution. People of color that resulted in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment when we abolished slavery, and women who took, about 75 years between the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, Women's Rights Convention, the first one in Seneca Falls, New York, to the 1920 19th Amendment validation. So we believe that we have to be like those people who came and preceded us by building a movement for power. And in this day and age, in the 21st century, to bring that kind of power to force Congress to do maybe what they are not inclined to do, that movement has got to be multiracial, intergenerational, politically independent, financially independent, and transpartisan. Those 5 things. And that's what we are trying to consciously and deliberately do. To reach out to young people, to include people of color, to make sure that we are not attached to any political party, to make sure that we are financially independent, not connected to any corporation, government, funded by union, big foundation, even super duper wealthy people, because all of them have certain strings attached. And historically, movements have gone on to die when they have financial strings by other groups. And then we need to be transpartisan, cutting across the political landscape. So that is what our goal is all about in building this movement. And what it is we're trying to do is here. If you open up the brochure, this constitutional amendment, it's called the We the People Amendment. And what it says, basically, these 2 radical concepts. Section 1, natural persons have constitutional rights. Basically saying only human beings should have inalienable constitutional rights. Radical concept, right? Only people should be people. No other entity should be considered a person with inalienable constitutional rights. Now, they may have statutory rights, but that's a whole different animal. And corporations should have statutory rights. And it should be said that when we talk about ending corporate constitutional rights, that includes for-profit corporations, non-profit corporations, and unions. Okay? To be legit, it's got to be that. Now, some unions have problems with it, most don't, because their power doesn't come from trying to outraise and outspend the corporate crowd. If you're in that ball game, you are going to lose. Your power, labor power, comes from people power. And if you can offset money power, guess what? People power rises more to the surface. And a lot of unions get that and understand it, and that's why we've got support from many statewide AFL-CIOs across the country. So that's the one thing, to say that corporate constitutional rights should not exist. And second, that money is not free speech. Money's not free speech, money's property, right? Just like the crown jewels you have hidden in your basement somewhere, the car you drive, the clothes on your back, those things are property. If money is speech, then those who have the most money, guess what? Have the most speech. And they're able to drown out the voice of people without money. Last time I checked, that's not a real good definition of anything approaching an authentic, legitimate democracy or democratic republic or republican form of government, but more like an oligopoly, a monocracy, a corporatocracy. All of those are much more accurate than a democracy or a republican form of government. All right, almost done here. So that's what we're trying to do. Focus on both of these dimensions. Now, I just want to spend a minute to talk about this first part, because most people think that when you're including corporations in all of this, you're only addressing, and that we're only addressing, the corporate involvement in elections, sort of corporate political speech in which corporations have preempted, if you will, the First Amendment. And that certainly is part of it. But that ain't the only part. There are many, many other ways that corporations for more than a century, look at the timeline, all the way down here, about 1/4 of the way over, is when there was a decision in 1886 called Santa Clara versus Southern Pacific Railway that gave corporations, for the first time legitimately, 14th Amendment inalienable constitutional rights. 14th Amendment? 14th Amendment. One of the post-Civil War amendments that was designed to apply and support the liberation of freed black slaves, specifically to give due process and equal protection. That was preempted by corporations to apply to them, so they argued with a straight face. And the courts went along. 14th Amendment. That was just the beginning, the floodgate of corporations hijacking or preempting the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure right, Fifth Amendment, takings clause, commerce clause that allows products to move from state to state, and corporations saying, if you as a state are trying in the name of protecting health, safety, and welfare, if you're trying to keep out toxic trash, if you're trying to keep out, big hog farms, if you're trying to keep out, things that you consider to be noxious, you really think you can do that? Even if it's democratically passed laws, even if there's citizen initiatives, like what happened in a place like Iowa and other states, when in the past you had the naivete to really think you could keep out people who aren't working the land to own the land? Come now. How can you really think that you have the right to do that when corporations can all of a sudden say, oh, that is a violation of the Commerce Clause, and you can't do that. You don't have the right to enforce the police power to promote health, safety, and welfare. Our right to look at toxic trash or whatever else isn't toxic trash, it's commerce. And so long as you can reframe things as commerce, you can then overturn democratically enacted laws. And between the 14th Amendment and the Commerce Clause, those two things together, if you remember nothing else of my babbling tonight, and I'm almost done, if you remember nothing else, just remember this, that it's the 14th Amendment and the Commerce Clause, corporations winning those rights that were never intended on them, but that they acquired, those two rights never intended, they used, abused, and misused a couple of hundred times to overturn democratically enacted laws at the state level that protected workers, residents, consumers, communities. And the reason I bring that up is because if all we do, and I didn't even mention the First Amendment right not to speak, okay? And there have been instances where companies, have been asked because the states, many states have passed laws, for example, state of Vermont, a number of years ago passed a law saying people who are entities that have bovine growth hormones in dairy products, never mind prohibiting them, they should at least be listed on products. Companies went to court and said, you are violating my First Amendment right not to speak, meaning I shouldn't have you shouldn't authorize me to disclose that, the right not to speak. So what that means is that the good people of the state of Vermont and the legislators who had the audacity to think that they could pass a law that protected the health, safety, and welfare, the right to know, guess what? That got preempted by corporate rights not to speak. So we say we're a country that's trying to promote human rights. Baloney. It's corporate rights. And why that's important, again, 14th Amendment, Commerce Clause, is because if all we do is overturn Citizens United, if all we do is get rid of Buckley versus Vallejo, if all we do is get rid of political corporate rights, they'll go back to using all of these anti-democratic hammers that they used very effectively for decades to bludgeon our ability to decide. And that's why we need the whole enchilada approach. And so move to amend. I'll end it here by just simply saying that we are about the business of trying to build a movement, a powerful movement. And some of the ways we're trying to do that is, and some of the devices and some of the tactics, some of the campaigns are to try to get communities, and we've gotten over 700 communities all across the country. I think the only one in Iowa is Iowa City, to pass resolutions or ballot initiatives to say corporations are not people, money's not speech. We're trying to build a movement, trying to build awareness. Several hundred groups, organizations, from national to local, have passed resolutions calling for this very thing, including labor organizations, religious organizations, good government groups, many other type of organizations. We have something called Pledge to Amend that's trying to focus on our friends here at the state level, who are persons who might, we think, at some point, hopefully, be asked to verify. Or once a constitutional amendment is passed at the congressional level, it needs to be ratified at the state level. So it's important that we try to get people at the state level and the local level to pledge to say that if this comes before them, they will vote for it. Because we know that a lot of our federal people today were state people yesterday, and the day before that they were local people. And they're more accessible than people at the federal level. So it's important we work on that. Many other campaigns, we have groupings that are specifically working, caucuses on reaching out to labor, on people of faith, on educators, and people who are artists and culture. We think this is extremely important. And the very last thing I'll say is this, that to make this work, we try very much to encourage in communities where we come and do this kind of thing that I'm doing tonight, to encourage, to start a Move to Amend group in your community. I'll pass out here momentarily a form that has a number of ways that you can help out, including checking off if you're interested in helping start working with others and working with us at the national level to help you start a Move to Amend affiliate. It's the only way, and it's the best way at a local level to try to push this agenda along. Lastly, there's a Chinese saying that goes like this: you are likely to end up where you are headed. Where are we headed? Toward greater democracy and self-determination, self-governance? Not a pretty picture at this point. And I don't think that by doing nothing, sitting back, or just screaming, yelling, and the like, is sufficient. Nor is simply, as important as it is, reacting, responding, and resisting to the latest horrific thing coming down our way from Washington, from Des Moines, from our local community. Those sorts of reactive, responsive things in our face are important. But if we ignore not just opposing, that's what sort of reacting is, but proposing, not just being on the defense, but going on the offense. We have to focus more fundamentally in that way. Otherwise, I don't know about you, but I'm tired of just responding, resisting, and reacting. I don't have a life that I'm going to live 200-300 years, where I can perpetually do that forever and ever and ever and ever. And my friends, we will do that forever and ever and ever unless we say enough. Time to stop it. It's time to focus on the fundamentals. This isn't the only one. Not, be clear, not trying to oversell. We need to continue to do the good work in responding and reacting and resisting, but at some point we have to go on the offense. This is one way to go on the offense, to say what we want that we think is going to address so many of the root causes and make it easier to promote all of the issues we care about. So I will pass out the information. I apologize for going so long. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, for that presentation.